Hi, and thanks for joining me on this quick 10-minute whistle-stop tour of the English language paper 2, question 2. Now, question 2 is all about understanding our summary of inferences. And for this, we're just going to spend 10 minutes looking at how we understand the question and what we need to respond by, how we annotate for inferences, and how we construct a response. The thing with this question is always the case of because, and I think because of the fact that it is source A and source B, it is often the question that we spend the most amount of time on. But actually, if we keep this question as simple as possible and as concise as possible, it is a quick and easy win. So let's have a look first off at the question itself. The question focuses our attention on two different sources. When we are looking at these two sources and when we're looking at the question, I think it's important to know that we're always going to be prepared by sharing those two sources together. We're always going to be given a brief information about what the sources include. In this case, for example, it's about traveling on a very different types of boat. And then we get our latter bit that focuses on what the question is actually asking. So in this case, for example, we're choosing to focus a summary of what you understand about the different boats. Now, this is where we've got to really pick apart the question and find as much detail as possible. We'll always know that it is a summary question, but it's the understanding of what the focus point is that makes a big difference. So we've seen questions where it's been looking at the differences, looking at the similarities, or looking at both. What can't happen is where actually you deviate from the question and instead you focus on perhaps the similarities when it's asking for the differences and vice versa, because then what you're not doing is you're not answering the question. Also, pay a particular attention to the focus point. So in this case, it's asking about the different boats, not the characters, not the people involved, not the writers, not the locations, but the boats themselves. And that's in any circumstance. It's so important to understand what your focus point is, because the moment that you go away from that is the moment that you stop answering the question. Now, the AOs for this question are the assessment objectives that all examiners use when they are marking this response. In this case, we know that you're being asked to identify and interpret explicit and implicit information. So you're finding the obvious and perhaps the little less obvious. Think about the complete reverse of what we ask you to do for language paper 1, question 1, where you list 4 things. We always ask that you've got to keep it really explicit. In this case, we want the implicit, we want the inference to come from it. And in order to do that properly, we need to find that evidence and we need to be able to construct our response around that evidence. Now, with that in mind, and when we're looking at that mark scheme, we're always going to be aiming for that level 4. We want to get as high as possible, and every single person is capable of doing so, particularly with a question that actually we can keep very, very simple. So what is it and what are the success criteria of this question based on the bullet points that all of the examiners get? Well, they are, of course, asked to make an understanding of your inferences. So what do you get from the question? What do you get from the text that's in front of you? When we talk about this idea of judicious references or the textual detail, we're talking about your quotes and your understanding of what you've got in front of you. Where's your evidence for it? So yes, you're making these inferences, but where is that evidence coming from? And then this final bullet point is often changed depending on what it's actually asking for. So in this case, we're asking for the differences. In certain circumstances, it might be statements show perceptive similarities between the text or vice versa. So that last one is completely dependent on whether or not you can answer the question. And when we consider from mocks, from previous examinations where people are going right and people going wrong with this, there's a couple of really quick wins that we can make to make this question as effective as possible. In this circumstance, and the analogy that I always like to use is this idea of understanding, if you were walking down the street and you saw someone trip into a pothole, obviously you'd help them up, but you would not then proceed to fall into the same pothole. And it's the same again, learn from our mistakes, learn from the mistakes that we visibly see in front of us. So in this case, we know that we need to keep quotations short and embedded. The longer that they are, the more that we are just copying, the more that we are likely to just repeat ourselves. We need to read the question carefully. It's very easy to lose focus and deviate slightly from what is actually being asked from us. And we definitely need to avoid analysis. As we mentioned before, the only assessment objective that you are being marked on is that AO1, that assessment 1. You're not being asked to analyse, you're not being asked to look at word level analysis, you're being asked to answer the question and to basically be able to justify your interpretation using those evidence points that you've pointed out. We're also looking at around about 2 paragraphs for this question with a range of quotations. And what I mean by a range of quotations, I mean not a constant repetition of the same one. When I do say 2 paragraphs as well, I do think it's important to recognise that there will be some people that write just one long extended piece for this. What I don't want is I don't want paragraphs to be forced into it. And I don't think anyone wants that circumstance. Instead, use that as a guideline as to how much I'd expect you to write for this question. In 10 minutes, I'd expect you to get out a substantial amount of really good, solid quotes that you can use to support your interpretations. Now, let's have a look at how we can annotate this response based on one example of the question. When we, look at the question in a bit of detail, it says both sources describe the behaviour and appearances of prisoners. Write a summary, so we know it's a summary of the differences, so we know we're looking at the differences between the prisoners in each source. So we are looking specifically in this case at the prisoners. Now, apologies for the state of my handwriting on this. However, let's take a look at some in a bit of detail. So first off, on source A, for example, let's have a look at the fact that they are men of all ages and appearances. Now, the fact that they're all ages could suggest that we've got a bit of a range. Okay, and we're able to see that range take place. When we look down, we see that they're hardened old offenders. So you've got hardened old offenders in there, and we basically ask ourselves, well, what does that mean? Okay, so it's, you could go with something quite strong, that they're quite used to it. Any of those word choices, that they're hardened, that they're experienced in a way, perhaps. And I'll just talk you through some of the other ones so you don't have to stare at this garish handwriting. But we've got things like a handsome boy. So we've got a contrast going on there, haven't we? You wouldn't say that, very attractive or anything like that, but you might say that actually they are not looking how you might originally perceive a prisoner to look, so to speak. The fact that they're youthful suggests that you've got people that are quite young in there. So you've got a range of ages, which reiterates that first statement that you've made. So you've got a lot of embedded quotes that could come. Decently dressed men means that they're well dressed, but what we can't do is we can't repeat ourselves. So like I've just said then, where I've gone, oh, well, it means that they're well dressed. Actually, that's a bit of repetition, isn't it? So if we're saying that they are decently dressed men, we might want to annotate it with something like they are smart. And it's just a little starting point. And that's all annotations are, really. Annotations are those starting points that just make our life so much easier when we come to the writing section. And it's why we say time and time again, look, we know that time is of an essence, but time spent planning is crucial because it means that your response is going to be clearer and more concise. We've got things like there was very little anxiety or mental suffering. So you might suggest there that there were not as many problems. And I think that ties in with what we've got when we look at section B. So in source B, we're looking at the same question, prisoners in each source, marginalized in society. So you might say that they are the segregated, they are the less, that they are people in society that you might not think of as much. We've got things like they suffer from addiction, so they are suffering. Okay, so these people and these prisoners are suffering in that way. We've got that they are underpinned by poverty, so we know that they are poor. And this is it. I'm only asking the word choices. But as I'm going through, I'm making a quick note of those word choices so that they are there for me in the future. And like I said, apologies for that awful handwriting. When we're talking about her mental health worsened severely, you might say something like that what you can't say in those circumstances is that it got worse, but you might say that actually that struggle developed or heightened when in prison. And it's all about thinking,
if you're really good at those synonyms, if you're really good at the word association game, you'll be amazing at this. It's all about how else could you say it. Lost almost a third of his body weight, so you might say there that he's malnourished. That he's clearly, you know, back to this idea of him suffering, so to speak. And then we've got I can't breathe. So actually we're seeing a physical response and a physical restraint on someone. Now, what I like to do then in those circumstances, imagine that those were all annotated with 1 or 2 words. Okay, that's what it needs to look like for this question. And then go to myself, right, before I start writing, it's about the differences. So what are the obvious differences in this case? Now, there are quite a few that we can talk about, but some of the ones that I might say is about the suffering, because it's clearer in source B that there is a lot more suffering going on. And all I do is just make a little note to myself of 1 or 2 clear differences between them. You know, it even says it at the bottom of source A about the mental state. So we've got there about their mental state and how that, you know, comes about and how that's all put together. So then we look at a response and we look at how these responses can be structured. And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, doesn't it? It's about making sure short, concise, embedded quotations along with your inference, avoiding any kind of analysis, avoiding any kind of overcomplicated nonsense, and making sure that you stick to the question. Let's have a look at this example. So one significant difference between the 2 sources is the mental health issues that were experienced by the prisoners. So straight away I've answered the question. Whereas the men in source A were seen to have had very little anxiety, source B focuses more on the fact that the prisoners issued worsened severely. Look at the way that we are embedding those quotations. I think the moment that you start to embed quotations is the moment that your responses begin to develop further, with some demonstrating physical issues, including an inability to breathe. There is also a substantial difference between the appearance of those described within both sources. The boys in source A being seen as youthful and handsome, and handsomely dressed, presenting quite a well-kept and unaffected appearance, whilst one prisoner in source B is identified as having lost a third of his body weight whilst in prison, illustrating the poor conditions and the malnourishment that he has experienced. Now, look at the way that we are approaching those inference points as well. We're not repeating ourselves. We are basically all of that basing, you know, we're going off our annotations, we're going off our key ideas in order to do so. So that was just a whistle-stop tour throughout all of it. I'd like to just reiterate some of the key points that are picked up on at the very start when we're looking at how to do this properly. Very much keeping them short and embedded, reading the question carefully, avoiding analysis, and making sure that you're writing enough for this response. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope that this has been useful.